I want to talk about parity. I want to talk about parity because, every week the power rankings get more and more divisive. And here's why. Here's what it is. So if you're a fan of any of the 15 teams that's on this board, you've got a shot, right? And some of these teams are playing well and some of them aren't, but they're still in a pretty good spot. So when people talk about standings, I kind of brush it off for this very reason. Columbus has 52 points. They are 19th in the National Hockey League. The New York Islanders are 6 points ahead of them with 58. They are 14 spots ahead of them in the standings. It is very easy to go from 52 to 54 points, and it jumps you up past 1, 2, 3, 4. At least 4 teams getting there, and depending on regulation wins and everything, it could be as many 5, 6, or 7 teams you pass with 1 victory in the overall standings. This is why when people talk to me, oh, well, in the overall standings, your power rankings should reflect. No. Here's Calgary, right? They're standing at 6, 7, 8, 9, 10th overall. So they're 10th overall. With a loss, combined with a victory by somebody else in their division, they could fall as many as 2 spots in the division, maybe 3, right? And not only that, but they could fall right out of the playoffs if they lose 2 games in a row and the right combination of things happen. I don't think parity in the NHL has ever been stronger. I know I've said this before in videos in previous seasons, and this is what the NHL has a 3-point system for. This is why we have the overtime and shootout losses as single points, is to create that. And sometimes people call it the illusion of parity. For instance, you've got 8 points of the overtime or shootout variety that have helped keep Columbus in it. Now, Columbus is playing well right now, but without those points being counted, they'd be 22 and 24. And then we're in a situation where they're at 44 points, and the Jets, for instance, would have 48. And up here, you'd have the Islanders with 54 points. So suddenly, it's a 10-point difference instead of 6. So that's where the overtime loss point comes in, and that's why some fans, myself included, the overtime loss points we feel skew things a little bit, and they do create the illusion of parity, and they do make it so that on trade deadline day you won't see as many sellers as you would otherwise. And I actually think it causes there to be less trades. As a good for instance here, if let's say you're Arizona and you're looking to beef things up, well, nobody in the West who's in this area is going to trade with you. Nobody who is worried about helping you is going to trade with you. And it may include some central teams who look and go, you know what, they could bump us out of a wild card spot potentially. We're not going to help them. So your trading partners are greatly diminished compared to what they would have been, say, back in the 80s, where you had clear sellers and buyers. And not only that, but there were more hockey trades that were made. Because again, I may look at your team and go, you need a forward, we need a defenseman, we can sit down and talk. But if you're a rival, I might say, yeah, I don't think so. And so by having standings that are this bunched together, you have more rivals. It means games are more important, which should generate more ticket sales than having situations where more fan bases are tuned out because their team's done for the year anyways. But, interestingly enough, I could have expanded this to 61 points at the top end and 49 points at the back end and made it even, more pronounced in terms of how many teams are on the board when there's a 12-point spread, but I felt 12 points was too high. And yet Nashville isn't on this board, and I don't think there's that many people right now that would be that surprised if they went on a little bit of a run and made the playoffs because they have a roster that should be capable of doing that. I can't think of a time where we've had parity this strong. And I'm sure if I look back a year ago today, I'd go, no, it was pretty strong then too. But it does make it difficult because, again, if you're a Dallas fan right now, you have to look at things and say, hey, we're doing pretty well. We've only lost 7 in regulation or 8 in regulation since our first 9 games. However, Dallas is one cold streak of 4 or 5 games away from potentially being on this side of the board and ending up underneath the Oilers and the Jets and outside of a playoff spot. The Jets have 52 points. Dallas has 56. This is why when people say, oh, this team's on a winning streak, they're in good shape. They're going to make the playoffs. Why wouldn't they make the playoffs? Because the line to make the playoffs is going to be probably, I would think, 92 or 93 points in both the East and the West, and maybe a little bit lower than normal. But that's because at this point it projects out to have more teams that are above 500 and in that 92, 93 point range. I think we're gonna have some fan bases at the end of this year that are kind of mad about not being in the playoffs, and it may lend itself to some more of an argument about whether or not they want to expand the playoffs when Seattle comes in. There's been talk about it. Gary Bettman doesn't want it. I don't think a majority of the owners want it. But the idea of having a situation where 20 teams are able to get into that 16-game tournament that we have for the Stanley Cup every year, so you'd have a play-in. You'd have wild cards playing their way in. Think like baseball. Baseball's wild card game where it's a one-off, and maybe doing that so the teams that just barely missed the top 16 still have a chance to get in with a one-game playoff. I don't know when that happens, but I would think in this day of parity where there are a lot of teams that barely miss the playoffs, and you're going to see teams miss the playoffs that would have made it in the other conference, that may gain more steam, especially if we see things this tight right up till the end of the year. But it is an interesting thing because right now Calgary's a top 10 team in the league, and yet they're only 1 point ahead of 11, 12, 13, 14th. So 1 point separates them from being 14th, and 2 points separate them from being 16th in the NHL. And then 3 points separates them from being right down to 19th. It's tough. And it's got to be tough for the players if they pay attention to this. And I know they all say they don't. Most of them will say they don't anyways. But they have to. They have to be looking and going, geez, we've got 5 wins in a row. We've got 6 wins in a row. And yet we're still in this clog. There's this whole, clog. Like, for instance, right now people are talking a lot about Toronto. Like, they're not very good. And yet Toronto was great to get to this record. And yeah, they've lost a few games now. But can they turn it around? Absolutely. And they're only 12th in the NHL out of 31 teams. And they're only 4 points out of being 5th in the overall record category in the National Hockey League. So this is the trick. And if you're Kyle Dubas, this has to just give you nightmares. When you look at this and you go, we're a middle of the pack team, but the elite contenders are only a few points ahead of us. So what are you doing at the deadline? And for a lot of these teams, it's going to be really interesting to see what they do at the deadline because everybody's going to have that same thought. We're close. We're close. And then in the playoffs, we'll see which ones actually are and which ones are not. And it's easy for us to sit right now and prognosticate and say, oh, well, clearly these teams are contenders. But last year we thought we knew as well, and they were all out in the first round. Every division winner was out in the first round. So I guess the question I have to you guys is this a season where we're going to see this clog of teams all with the same number of points, or at least close to it, only a 6-point difference between 5th and 19th? Is this going to be the normal right up till the end? And by the end, I mean the trade deadline. Because, yeah, after trade deadline, there's at least a couple of teams on this board that are going to, at the deadline, say, you know what? This team isn't going anywhere. Even if we make the playoffs, we might as well sell some guys off and get ready for next year. And there are definitely going to be at least a couple of teams on this board that completely fall off the map. But are we going to see right up until trade deadline things staying this packed, this close together, making the job of the general manager more difficult? Because if you're down to 19th, that means at most you have 12 teams that are looking and saying, all right, we're willing to trade off expiring contracts. Well, Nashville's not on the board, but they're not doing that. And the Rangers, I don't know what the Rangers are going to do. I guess Kreider ends up going, but I don't know. Because, again, there are definitely Rangers fans out there who are going to say, hey, we've got a shot at this. Because when you get into how many teams are too far out of the playoffs to think about it, that's a whole other conversation as well. There aren't very many. So, and every Saturday I do power rankings and I look at the board and I go, man, there are going to be people that are upset because this. And I get it. Totally get it. And I can't really pay attention to this because if I pay attention to all of this, then that board becomes completely useless to me. I'm going to apologize for any beeps here in the background. I mentioned this in the video I did this morning, the news of the day. They're installing security stuff, so you may hear some security beeping and stuff as stuff gets set up. So, Yeah, this is quite a year for parity, and this is what the NHL wanted. And it does mean that we have to standings watch every night. I will say this in the review videos and just in general, tracking the standings every day. It's fascinating. It's fascinating because every day it changes greatly. You look at Vegas, 54 points in 48 games. Are they a contender? Fans outside Vegas would say probably not, but there's Vegas fans that are definitely looking at this team and saying, you know what, we've got a shot at this. When you look at their forwards and you look at Marc-Andre Fleury can get hot in the playoffs. Yes, the blue line is a concern, but they're not that far out, and they're only 4 points back of fifth overall in the National Hockey League. And not only that, they're only 1 point out of first in their division. So yeah, the parity is strong right now, and it seems to be across every division. You are going to have St. Louis, Washington, and Boston likely looking down on the rest of their division for the rest of the year. Although Tampa may have something to say about that. Pittsburgh may have something to say about that. Dallas really isn't threatening St. Louis right now, but there's parity. So who knows? Maybe one of them comes back down to earth. All right, so question to you guys. Which one of these teams ends up dropping off the map? And which one of these teams needs to make a big move at the deadline and can really go all in based on where they are in the standings, which is in the middle of this giant schmozzle. So there you go. Thank you guys so much for watching. As always, don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happened upon this video, and Parity's here. It's here, and this is the kind of races the NHL wants. They want a situation where all of these teams are basically in a very similar position. Thank you guys so much for watching, for all your support. It means a ton. I will talk to you again soon.